What if I told you the man who saved America started life with nothing? No money, no education, no power. He lost his mother at 9, failed again and again, was mocked, doubted, and nearly broken. Yet when his country faced destruction, he stood alone, carrying the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of strength built in the hardest years, and what he sacrificed to protect freedom will change how you see struggle forever. In 1776, a new nation was born in conflict. The American colonies stood before the world and declared independence from Britain. They spoke words filled with hope and danger at the same time. We will be free. But freedom did not arrive with peace or celebration. Britain did not accept this decision, and war followed. For 7 long years, the American people suffered. Soldiers marched without shoes, their feet bleeding on frozen ground. Food was scarce. Many men fought while hungry and weak. Families waited in silence, fearing every knock on the door, afraid it might bring news of death. Britain had one of the strongest armies and navies in the world. America had courage, but little else. Still, the colonies refused to surrender. They believed freedom was worth pain, hunger, and sacrifice. In 1781, at Yorktown, the British Army finally surrendered. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as a free nation. Bells rang in towns and cities. People celebrated in the streets. The war was over, but freedom was incomplete. While America was free from British rule, millions of people living inside the new nation were still enslaved. Slavery had not ended with independence. In fact, it continued and expanded. In the northern states, some leaders slowly began to question slavery and move toward ending it. In the southern states, slavery became stronger, protected by laws and driven by cotton plantations that depended on forced labor. America became a nation divided against itself. Half free, half enslaved, this division was not quiet. It lived in arguments at dinner tables, in violent confrontations, and in political decisions that pushed the nation closer to disaster. Every new state joining the Union raised the same dangerous question: would it allow slavery or not? With every answer, anger grew stronger. The ground beneath the nation cracked a little more each year. It was into this fragile and divided country that a boy was born. On February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin in Kentucky, a child entered the world with no advantages. There was no doctor present, no warm bed, no wealth waiting for him. The cabin had a dirt floor. Cold air slipped through cracks in the wooden walls. Outside, the land was rough and unforgiving. Life began with hardship. The child was named Abraham Lincoln. His father was a farmer and carpenter who worked long hours for little reward. His mother was gentle and caring, teaching her son kindness, honesty, and patience. The family owned very little. Every day required physical labor just to survive. Food came from farming and hunting. Clothes were made at home. Nothing was easy and nothing was certain. From an early age, Abraham learned that life did not offer comfort freely. Survival demanded effort. Strength came from endurance. He watched his parents struggle and understood that hardship was not temporary. It was part of life. Then, when Abraham was only 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother became sick and died from milk sickness, an illness caused by poisoned milk. The loss was sudden and devastating. Young Abraham watched the strongest source of love and safety in his life disappear forever. He did not have the words to explain his pain, but the silence that followed stayed with him for years. Grief entered his life early, and it shaped him. After his mother's death, the home felt colder and emptier. Abraham worked more. He spoke less. Inside, questions began to form. Why do good people suffer? Why does life take without warning? He did not know the answers, but the questions stayed. There were few schools near Abraham's home. Education was not considered important for poor frontier families. Sometimes a traveling teacher arrived and taught children for a few weeks in a cabin or barn. Then the teacher moved on. In total, Abraham received less than 1 year of formal education. Most boys would have accepted this reality. Abraham did not. He discovered books, and they changed him. He borrowed them from neighbors whenever possible. At night, after long days of physical labor, he sat near the fire and read. When he had no paper, he wrote on wooden boards with charcoal. His hands were rough from work. His eyes burned from reading in weak light. Still, he continued. He read the Bible. He read stories, history, and books about law. He read slowly, carefully, often reading the same page again and again until he understood it. Each book opened a small window into a larger world. Learning became his escape from poverty and pain. It gave him something no one could take away. As the years passed, Abraham's family moved several times, searching for better land and better opportunities. Each move brought more hard work. Abraham split logs, plowed fields, and carried heavy loads for long hours. People noticed his strength and endurance. They began calling him the rail splitter. Despite the physical exhaustion, his mind never rested. He thought deeply. He listened closely. He observed people and learned how they spoke, argued, and explained themselves. He was quiet, but when he spoke, others listened. Later, Abraham worked as a clerk in a small village store. He was careful and fair in his work. If he made a mistake, he corrected it immediately. If he overcharged a customer by even a few cents, he walked miles to return the money. His honesty became known throughout the area. People trusted him. They began calling him Honest Abe, but honesty alone did not quiet his restlessness. Inside, Abraham felt that his life must have a larger purpose. He did not yet know what that purpose was, but he felt it pulling him forward, urging him to learn more, speak more, and understand the world beyond the frontier. As Abraham Lincoln grew into a young man, the quiet restlessness inside him became stronger. He was known for his honesty and strength, but inside he felt unfinished. He wanted more than survival. He wanted meaning. He wanted to understand how society worked and how people could be treated more fairly. In his early 20s, Abraham began to speak more often in public. At village gatherings, people noticed something unusual about him. He did not speak with fancy words. He did not shout or insult others. Instead, he spoke slowly and clearly. He used stories that ordinary people understood. When he made jokes, they were gentle. When he spoke seriously, people listened. At the age of 23, Abraham made a bold decision. He decided to run for public office. He believed that laws could improve lives and that honest leadership mattered. He had no money, no powerful supporters, and no formal education. All he had was his reputation and his belief in fairness. He lost the election. The loss was painful and public. People talked about it. Some laughed. Some said he was not good enough. Abraham felt disappointment deeply, but he did not allow it to harden him. Instead, he reflected. He asked himself what he lacked and how he could improve. He made a quiet promise to himself. He would prepare. He would study. He would grow. Abraham returned to books. He studied grammar so he could speak more clearly. He studied mathematics to sharpen his thinking. He read history to understand how nations rose and fell. He read law books page by page, often borrowing them from neighbors and walking miles to return them on time. At night, by firelight, he practiced speech. As aloud, testing the rhythm of his words. Slowly, change began. He ran for office again. This time, he won. Serving in the state legislature was not glamorous. The work was slow and often frustrating, but Abraham took it seriously. He supported building roads and bridges so farmers could sell their crops. He believed education should be available to all children, not only the wealthy. He spoke against unfair laws, even when it made others uncomfortable. What made him different was not anger, but reason. He argued calmly. He listened carefully. Even his opponents admitted that he was fair. He did not attack people. He attacked ideas. At the same time, Abraham continued his journey into law. In those days, attending a university was not required to become a lawyer. Instead, one could study independently. Abraham read legal texts again and again, rewriting complex ideas into simple language until he truly understood them. After years of self-study, he passed the bar exam and became a licensed lawyer. In court, he gained respect for his honesty and clarity. Judges trusted him. Clients trusted him. He did not twist the truth to win cases. He believed the law should serve justice, not power. Still, his path was not smooth. Abraham lost many political opportunities. He sought higher positions and failed. He watched others succeed where he did not. These moments tested his patience and confidence. More than once, he questioned whether his efforts mattered. Yet each failure taught him something. He learned humility. He learned endurance. He learned that progress was slow but possible. As the years passed, America grew more divided. The issue of slavery poisoned politics. Every new territory created conflict. People argued violently over whether slavery should spread. In some places, blood was already being spilled. Abraham felt deeply troubled. He believed slavery was morally wrong. He believed no person had the right to own another. But he also believed the nation must remain united. These beliefs pulled him in painful directions. He spoke out carefully but firmly. He warned that a nation divided between freedom and slavery could not survive forever. His words spread beyond his state. Newspapers printed his speeches. People began to notice him. Not everyone agreed with him. Some accused him of being dangerous. Others said he spoke too honestly. But many ordinary citizens felt that he spoke for them. In 1858, Abraham took part in a series of public debates against a powerful political opponent. Crowds gathered by the thousands. The debates lasted for hours. His opponent was confident and polished. Abraham was plain and awkward in appearance. But when he spoke, his words carried weight. He spoke about fairness. He spoke about human dignity. He spoke about the future of the nation. He did not promise easy answers. He asked difficult questions. Although Abraham lost that election, something important happened. His ideas traveled across the country. His name became known far beyond his home state. Failure once again carried him forward. By 1860, the nation stood at the edge of collapse. Tension between North and South reached a breaking point. In this moment of uncertainty, Abraham Lincoln was chosen as a candidate for president. His message was simple. Slavery must not spread further. The nation must remain united. When the election results were announced, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. But celebration was short. Southern states believed his victory threatened their way of life. One by one, they declared they would leave the Union. Abraham faced the greatest challenge of his life. He did not want war. He wanted peace, he wanted unity. But he also believed that allowing the nation to break apart would destroy the very idea of democracy. As he prepared to take office, the country moved closer to violence. The burden on his shoulders grew heavier with each passing day. The boy who once read by firelight now stood responsible for a nation on the edge of disaster. As Abraham Lincoln stepped into the presidency, the ground beneath the nation finally broke apart. Southern states moved quickly. They announced they were leaving the Union and forming their own government. For them, Lincoln's election was not just political change. It was a threat to their way of life. They feared that slavery would one day be taken from them, and they chose separation over compromise. Lincoln watched these events with a heavy heart. He believed deeply in unity. He believed the United States was more than a collection of states. It was an idea, an experiment in self-government. If that experiment failed, the world would learn that democracy could not survive division. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with great care. He asked the nation to remain calm. He said that Americans were not enemies but friends. He hoped reason would prevail. But hope alone could not stop the storm. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War began. In that moment, Abraham Lincoln's life changed forever. The quiet lawyer and thoughtful speaker now carried the responsibility of commander-in-chief. He had almost no military experience. Yet he was responsible for directing a war that would decide the future of the nation. Millions of lives now rested on his decisions. The early years of the war were disastrous for the Union. Battles were lost. Generals hesitated or failed. Soldiers died in shocking numbers. Newspapers attacked Lincoln daily. Political opponents called him weak and unfit for leadership. Even members of his own government doubted him. Lincoln felt the pressure constantly. Every morning brought new reports of death. Every decision carried terrible consequences. He studied maps late into the night. He read telegrams from the battlefield again and again, searching for understanding, searching for hope. Leadership did not bring him pride. It brought loneliness. At night, when the White House was quiet, Lincoln walked its halls alone. He carried grief not only as a president but as a human being. He visited wounded soldiers in hospitals. He spoke softly to young men missing arms or legs. He listened to their stories. He felt their pain. He also wrote letters to grieving families, letters filled with compassion, humility, and sorrow. He did not write as a distant leader. He wrote as a man who understood loss. As the war continued, Lincoln faced a painful truth. Preserving the Union alone was not enough. The root of the conflict was slavery. As long as slavery existed, peace would never truly come. This realization tormented him. He knew that ending slavery would change the war forever. It would anger the South even more. It might drive border states away. It would cost more lives. But doing nothing felt worse. He believed that allowing slavery to continue would betray the nation's founding ideals. For months, Lincoln struggled with this decision. He waited for the right moment. He waited for a military opportunity. He prayed. He doubted. He feared history's judgment. Finally, he acted. On January 1, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With a single document, he declared that enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. The proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it changed the soul of the war. The Union was no longer fighting only to preserve itself. It was now fighting for human freedom. The reaction was fierce. Some celebrated, others condemned him. Critics accused him of going too far. Some said he had not gone far enough, but Lincoln accepted the criticism. He believed the decision was morally necessary. The war continued with renewed intensity. Battles like Gettysburg and Vicksburg filled the nation with both grief and hope. Blood soaked the fields. Entire towns mourned their dead. Yet slowly the tide began to turn. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to a small town in Pennsylvania to dedicate a cemetery. Thousands of soldiers lay buried there. The main speaker spoke for hours. Then Lincoln rose to speak. He spoke for only a few minutes. But those minutes changed history. He reminded the nation why the war was being fought. He spoke of equality. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of a new birth of freedom. His words were simple, but they carried deep meaning. They honored the dead and challenged the living. From that moment on, the war was not only about survival, it was about purpose. As 1864 approached, the nation grew tired. The war had lasted too long. Death had become common. Many Americans wanted peace, even if it meant compromise with slavery. Lincoln's popularity fell. His re-election was uncertain. He felt the weight of this doubt deeply. If he lost, the war might end without justice. Slavery might survive. Everything he had fought for could be undone. Then, late in the summer, a major victory came. Union forces captured a key southern city. Hope returned to the North. Confidence grew. Slowly, public support shifted. In November 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president. The people had chosen to continue the fight. Lincoln did not celebrate loudly. He knew the war was not over. He knew more lives would be lost. In his second inaugural address, he spoke not of victory but of healing. He urged Americans to act with humility and compassion. He spoke of binding the nation's wounds. Only months later, in April 1865, the Confederate Army surrendered. The war was finally over. The Union was saved. Slavery was on the path to being abolished forever. Peace had finally come, but Abraham Lincoln did not allow himself to relax. The war had ended, yet the nation was wounded in ways no treaty could quickly heal. Cities lay in ruins. Families were broken. Millions of formerly enslaved people stood at the edge of freedom, uncertain of what that freedom would truly mean. Lincoln understood that winning the war was only the beginning. The harder task was rebuilding the nation. He spoke often about mercy. He believed punishment would only create more hatred. He believed the South must be welcomed back, not crushed. His vision was clear but fragile. Many in the North wanted revenge. They wanted harsh punishment for the South. Lincoln resisted this anger. He believed bitterness would poison the future. Inside, however, he was exhausted. Years of war had aged him. His face was lined, his posture heavier. Those who knew him said he carried sadness quietly, like a shadow that never left. He had given everything he had to the nation, and it had cost him deeply, yet he still believed in hope. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Friends encouraged him to go. They believed he needed rest. The war was over. The danger, they thought, had passed. That night, laughter filled the theater. Music played. The audience relaxed. Lincoln sat in his box, unaware that history was moving toward a tragic moment. Behind the scenes, a man driven by hatred slipped quietly through the building. A single gunshot shattered the evening. Abraham Lincoln collapsed. The president was carried across the street to a small house. Doctors worked desperately through the night. Outside, crowds gathered in silence. No one wanted to believe what had happened. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hours now lay fighting for his life. At 7:22 in the morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The nation froze. Church bells rang slowly. Businesses closed. Soldiers wept openly. People filled the streets, crying together in shock and disbelief. Rich and poor, North and South, black and white, all felt the loss. For many Americans, it felt like losing a father. The man who had spoken of unity and compassion was gone at the very moment the nation needed him most. His death left a silence deeper than the war itself. Yet his life did not end with his final breath. In the days that followed, Lincoln's body traveled across the country by train. Millions stood along the tracks to pay their respects. Some bowed their heads. Some removed their hats. Some whispered prayers. People who had never met him felt as if they knew him. They remembered his words. They remembered his patience. They remembered his courage. Slowly, Abraham Lincoln became more than a man. He became a symbol of endurance in the face of suffering, a symbol of leadership without hatred, a symbol of strength, guided by compassion. His life proved something powerful. A person does not need wealth to lead. A person does not need perfect education to change history. What matters is character. What matters is the willingness to carry responsibility even when it is heavy. Lincoln had failed many times. He had been mocked, doubted, and attacked. Yet he never allowed bitterness to control him. He believed deeply in fairness. He believed deeply in humanity. The nation he left behind struggled to live up to his vision. Reconstruction was painful. Progress was slow. Injustice did not disappear overnight. But the direction had changed. Freedom had taken root. For generations to come, people would look back at Abraham Lincoln not as a perfect man, but as a human being who chose what was right even when it was hard. His story reminded the world that leadership is not about power over others, but service to something greater. And so, the boy born in a cold log cabin, with no wealth and little education, became one of the most important figures in history. Not because he was fearless, but because he acted despite fear. Not because he was free from doubt, but because he moved forward despite doubt. His life teaches a simple lesson that reaches beyond time and language. Strength is not found in comfort. It is built in the hardest years. For anyone listening to this story, especially those learning a new language or searching for direction, Abraham Lincoln's journey carries meaning. Growth takes patience. Failure is not the end. And even the heaviest burdens can be carried one step at a time. The story of Abraham Lincoln is not only the story of a nation, it is the story of human resilience. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, courage and compassion can shape the future. The nation breathed again. For the first time in years, peace felt possible. After Abraham Lincoln's death, the nation struggled to move forward without him. His absence was felt in every decision, every argument, every wound left by the war. Many wondered what kind of country America would become without the steady hand that had guided it through chaos. The years that followed were difficult. Freedom had been declared, but equality was not yet real. Millions of formerly enslaved people were free in name, yet faced poverty, fear, and resistance. The promise Lincoln spoke of was alive but fragile. It needed time, courage, and continued effort to grow. Still, Lincoln's words did not fade. They were repeated in classrooms, spoken in public squares, written in books, and remembered in quiet moments. People returned to his speeches not because they were long or complex, but because they were honest. He spoke in a way ordinary people could understand. He used simple language to express deep ideas. That was his power. He believed that democracy depended on ordinary citizens. He believed that leadership existed to serve, not to dominate. He believed that moral courage mattered more than popularity. As years passed, statues were built in his honor. His face appeared in books and monuments. But his true legacy lived beyond stone and metal. It lived in the idea that a nation could correct itself, that mistakes could be faced, that injustice could be challenged. Lincoln never claimed to be perfect. He admitted doubt. He admitted mistakes. But he never stopped trying to do what he believed. Ved was right. That is why his story continues to matter. For learners of English, his life offers more than history. It offers understanding. His journey shows how language, patience, and clear thinking can shape the world. He used words not to confuse, but to connect. Not to divide, but to explain. His story also reminds us that progress is slow. Change brings resistance. Doing the right thing often brings loneliness. But the long path matters more than the easy one. Lincoln once carried the weight of a nation, but he began as a boy carrying firewood, books, and questions he could not yet answer. He grew not through comfort, but through hardship. Not through praise, but through persistence. That is why his life speaks to people across cultures and generations. You do not need a perfect beginning to make a meaningful journey. You do not need approval to keep learning. You do not need certainty to take the next step. Abraham Lincoln's strength was not loud. It was steady. It was built slowly, through years of effort, loss, and reflection. He proved that character is formed when no one is watching and courage is shown when giving up would be easier. Today, the world is still divided in many ways. People still struggle with injustice, fear, and uncertainty. In those moments, Lincoln's story reminds us that progress is possible, but it requires responsibility. Responsibility to think clearly, responsibility to act honestly, responsibility to care for others even in disagreement. This is why his life remains important, not only for Americans but for anyone seeking strength during difficult times. The boy from the log cabin did not change the world alone, but he helped guide it toward a better direction. And his journey continues to inspire those who believe that effort matters, learning matters, and courage grows in the hardest years. For those listening, reading, or learning through this story, remember this final thought. Language grows with patience, strength grows with struggle, and even the longest journey begins with quiet determination. Abraham Lincoln's life was not easy, but it was meaningful, and that is why it endures.